I am Sheer, 29 years old, and my life began to unravel the moment my mother forced me into a marriage I never wanted, with a man I had never met. Everyone around me, neighbors, distant relatives, even so-called friends, kept repeating the same poisoned words. He's rich, you're lucky, as if wealth could erase fear, silence pain, or compensate for the suffocating dread of being bound to a stranger. On the wedding night, he leaned close, his voice calm yet unsettling, and whispered, "I'll be back tomorrow." The words should have been comforting, but the way his eyes darted from mine, almost as though he carried a secret too heavy to confess, sent a shiver down my spine. Tomorrow never came. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and he never returned. Instead, I found something that twisted my fate forever. File hidden at the back of his closet, tucked beneath expensive suits that still smelled faintly of cologne. Inside were documents, photographs, and names that made my hands tremble. "This is your husband." Those words were stamped across the cover like a verdict, and the face staring back at me from the first page was not the man I had seen at my wedding. That discovery lit the first spark of suspicion, and with suspicion came the shadow of fear. Who had I married? Where had he gone? And why did the truth feel more dangerous than his absence? The file weighed heavier than any chain of gold my family had forced around my neck during the wedding. My fingers trembled as I turned each page, the rustling sound echoing in the silent bedroom like whispers of the dead. The man in the photographs was a stranger, not the one who had held my hand before, disappearing into the night, but someone older, colder, with eyes that looked straight into the camera as though he knew one day I would be staring back at them. His name was printed clearly. Rasa Karim, 42 years old, a businessman with ties to offshore companies, properties in 3 different countries, and a trail of financial dealings that felt less like investments and more like crimes. My heartbeat pounded so loudly I could barely hear myself breathe. If this was truly my husband, then who was the man I had been given to on my wedding night? Why had my mother insisted this marriage was my fortune, my blessing, when it reeked of a calculated trap? I felt as though I had been sold, not married, exchanged like a pawn in a game I did not understand. Every page revealed more lie signatures that didn't match, passports with different names, and receipts for places I'd never been. The last page shook me the most. A letter addressed to Mrs. Sheer Karim. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. You are safer not knowing the truth. But if you dig deeper, be prepared to face what he left behind. My throat closed. My hands shook, but the fire inside me sparked to life. I couldn't stay silent anymore. If this marriage was built on lies, then uncovering those lies was the only way to take back my life. That night I barely slept. The house felt like a mausoleum, every shadow stretching too long, every creak of the wooden floor like a warning. I kept the file pressed against my chest as though clutching at my anchor, me to some reality, though deep inside I already knew my world had slipped into something far darker. By morning, I decided to test the first lead inside, a crumpled receipt for a storage unit registered under my so-called husband's name. The address was on the other side of the city, a district I had only ever heard about in whispered conversations, the kind of place where people went missing, and nobody asked questions. I draped a black shawl around me, blending into the streets as though invisibility could protect me, and boarded a rickety bus that carried me closer to answers I wasn't ready for. The ride was long, filled with strangers whose eyes lingered too long, whose silence felt like suspicion, and I wondered if every gaze carried the weight of someone watching me deliberately. When I finally reached the storage facility, its gates loomed like iron jaws ready to swallow me whole. The guard barely glanced at the forged key I had taken from the closet, his indifference almost as chilling as suspicion would have been. Inside, I located the unit, my heart pounding so violently it felt as though the entire corridor could hear it. The door screeched as I pulled it open, dust spilling into the air like secrets disturbed from their graves. Stacked inside were boxes upon boxes, dozens of them, all labeled with different women's names. My knees nearly buckled. Every box was filled with documents, jewelry, clothing, passports, evidence of lives interrupted, women erased, and marriages that were never meant to last. And in the corner, half buried under another stack, one box bore my name. Sheer. I froze when I saw my name scrawled in thick black marker on that box, as though my existence had been catalogued before I even realized I was part of this nightmare. My breath quickened, my fingers numb as I pulled the box closer, the cardboard scraping against the concrete floor like nails on stone. Inside, I found fragments of a life I didn't even know was being tracked, copies of my school certificates, medical records, even old photographs of me with friends I hadn't seen in years. Every page whispered the same terrifying truth. Someone had been watching me long before the marriage, documenting me as though I were a specimen under glass. At the very bottom of the box lay something that made my stomach twist violently. A small leather notebook, its cover cracked and stained. My hands shook as I opened it, only to find pages filled with my mother's handwriting. Line after line confirmed my worst fears. She had arranged the marriage knowing exactly who he was. She had bargained me away, not for my safety or future, but for money, influence, and a chance to climb into a world of corruption that had already swallowed too many lives. The final entry in her handwriting made my blood run cold. Sheer must never know the truth. If she finds out, everything will collapse. I dropped the notebook, my vision blurring with tears, fury rising inside me like a tidal wave. My own mother, the woman who had sworn to protect me, had betrayed me into the hands of a man who never intended to stay, who had left behind only shadows and secrets. And as I wiped my tears with trembling hands, I realized something else. If my name had a box, so did the others. And if I was still alive, maybe, just maybe, one of them could still be too. The air inside the storage unit thickened, pressing against my lungs as if the walls themselves wanted to silence me. My fingers hovered over the other boxes, names written in fading ink, some familiar, some not. I chose one at random, pried it open, and felt the blood drain from my face. Inside were wedding photographs, smiling brides beside the same man I had been told was my husband, his arm looped around them in identical poses, the same practiced smile stretched across his face. Each woman looked happy, unaware, their innocence preserved only in glossy prints that now reeked of deception. Beneath the photos were death certificates, different names, different dates, but the same pattern. Sudden accidents, unexplained illnesses, disappearances that ended in silence. My hands trembled as I shoved the lid back on, bile burning my throat. If my box existed, and theirs ended in death, then I wasn't just abandoned, I was meant to be next. My mind screamed for escape, yet my feet stayed rooted to the ground, pulled by the weight of the horror I had uncovered. I took out my phone, my finger hovering over the call button for the police. But then I froze. If my own mother was complicit, who could I trust? What if the police were part of this web? A sudden noiser, metallic clang echoing from the far end of the corridor, snapped me from my paralysis. Someone else was here. I shoved the notebook and a few documents from my box into my bag, slammed the unit shut, and ran, my pulse hammering louder than my footsteps. As I burst into the sunlight outside, one thought gnawed at me. I was no longer invisible. Whoever had followed me into that storage facility now knew exactly what I had found. The shelter became both refuge and prison, its cracked walls whispering stories of other women, whose faces blurred together in candlelight, each one carrying scars that mirrored my own. I sat cross-legged on the thin mattress, the leather notebook resting like a living heart beneath my palms, beating not with blood, but with secrets too dangerous to name aloud. Every hour that passed deepened the truth. I was not alone in being sold, abandoned, erased. There had been others, many others, and their boxes now sat stacked like gravestones in that storage unit. Some names matched headlines of women who had disappeared years ago, their fates dismissed as coincidence, tragedy, or rumor. But the ledger spoke with brutal clarity. They were all linked, each life reduced to an entry, each disappearance a transaction. Alia paced the narrow room, her voice sharp and unflinching as she mapped connections across scraps of paper. "This is bigger than marriage scams," she said, stabbing her finger at one page. "It's laundering, identity theft, trafficking of lives themselves." Her conviction both steadied and terrified me, because the higher we climbed into the truth, the closer we moved to the people who would do anything to stay hidden. I looked at her, at the fury carved into her face, and realized she had been waiting years for someone like me, a witness, a survivor, to confirm what she had long suspected. Together we began assembling our arsenal. Photographs sorted by date, financial slips lined up in patterns that revealed impossible coincidences, witness testimonies, pulled from the trembling mouths of women too afraid to sign their names. Every detail we uncovered was a thread in a web, spun by men who believed women like me were disposable, shadows without voices. And yet here I was, a shadow learning to speak, a pawn daring to become a player. Fear still clawed at me, cold and merciless, but beneath it burned something harder. The will to outlive them, to turn their ledger into evidence, to ensure that my name would not end in silence like the women who came before me. The following days bled into one another, each hour carrying the weight of secrets too sharp to hold. Alia and I worked in shadows, piecing together evidence like surgeons stitching torn flesh, careful not to let a single thread snap. She taught me how to move differently, never leaving the shelter the same way twice, never trusting a face that smiled too easily, always watching for reflections in shop windows that revealed more than streets ever could. The leather notebook became our compass, its brittle pages guiding us toward a truth too large to ignore. That was when Bilal entered the picture, a pale, exhausted clerk from one of the companies named in the files, a man who had once been just another cog in the machinery of deceit. He arrived shaking, his voice low, confessing that he had seen records altered, ledgers rewritten, women's names erased. He said he couldn't live with the ghosts anymore. His hands trembled as he slid a flash drive across the table, whispering, "This has everything. But once you open it, there's no turning back. They'll know it's missing." The drive felt heavier than stone in my palm, heavier even than the notebook, because it wasn't just a story anymore, it was proof. That night, we powered up an old laptop under the flickering bulb of the shelter's back room. Line after line of transactions appeared. Payments routed through shell companies, dates aligning with disappearances, signatures tying powerful names to unspeakable crimes. My stomach twisted with each revelation, yet a strange strength rose within me. For the first time, the nightmare was no longer intangible, it was real, undeniable, and documented. But as I stared at the screen, a cold realization pressed into my chest like a knife. If Bilal had brought this to us, then he had painted a target on all our backs. Sleep became a stranger after that night. I lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of the shelter, the faint hum of the city outside like a warning that never ended. The flash drive haunted me from the drawer where we hid it, its secrets humming louder than any lullaby. Alia insisted we move quickly, spreading copies across encrypted channels, sending fragments of the evidence to allies she trusted more than family. But fear gnawed at us both. Every sound outside the shelter seemed amplified, the growl of a motorcycle engine lingering too long, the shuffle of footsteps that stopped just short of our door, the flicker of headlights slicing through our window at odd hours. We were being watched, I could feel it in the marrow of my bones. Bilal's pale face replayed in my mind, his trembling words etched into my memory. They'll know it's missing. He hadn't been exaggerating. By the third day, I noticed the same silver sedan parked near the corner of the street, its tinted windows reflecting nothing but suspicion. Alia confirmed my fears with a grim nod. They won't come at us directly. Not yet. They'll wait for the right moment, the weakest crack. Her words tightened around my ribs like rope. We doubled our precautions, speaking in code, leaving decoy trails, splitting documents into pieces like shattered glass so no one person held the whole. But paranoia sharpened into certainty when a note slipped under our shelter door one evening, scrawled in hurried strokes. You don't belong in this story. Stop reading, or you'll be erased like the others. My hands shook as I read it aloud, and silence filled the room like smoke. Alia crushed the paper in her fist, her jaw set in stone. But I couldn't shake the chill of those words, because they didn't threaten me with death. They promised me oblivion, an erasure so complete that even my name would dissolve into nothing. The warning note clung to my mind like a shadow that refused to peel away, every word echoing louder each time I tried to push it into silence. I could almost feel invisible fingers brushing across my skin, as though someone was already beginning the process of erasing me. Still, surrender was no longer an option. I had seen too much, carried too many ghosts, and owed too many women their stolen voices. Alia and I decided the next step was to bring the evidence to someone who could not easily be bought, an independent journalist known for tearing through corruption like fire through dry grass. Her name was Sana, and her articles had forced ministers to resign, her pen sharper than any blade. Meeting her required us to weave through the city in a maze of misdirection, switching taxis, ducking into markets, cutting across alleys thick with smoke and spice. By the time we reached the cafe she'd chosen, my pulse throbbed in my ears like a drum. Sana sat at a corner table, her eyes alert, her smile faint but unwavering. We slid the flash drive across to her, along with the leather notebook. She scanned the pages with a practiced calm that belied the storm. I saw flickering behind her gaze. This isn't just corruption, she whispered, her fingers tightening on the paper. This is an industry built on broken lives. If this gets out, they'll burn cities to bury it. Her words carried the weight of prophecy, and in that moment I felt the ground beneath me tilt. Before we could leave, she added something that made my blood run cold. You should know there's already chatter in the networks. They're not just coming for you. They're coming for everyone whose hands have touched this evidence. The air thickened with the truth. The fight was no longer about survival. It was about endurance. In a war where exposure was the only weapon strong enough to wound them, but it would paint targets on all of our backs in letters written with fire. That night, Sana released only a fraction of the files, just enough to ignite a spark, but not enough to reveal the full blaze. The articles spread like wildfire, whispered in offices, shouted on television debates, dissected in late-night broadcasts. Faces of powerful men flickered across screens, their carefully sculpted reputations cracking like porcelain under the heat of suspicion. For a brief moment I felt hope, a fragile, flickering flame in a storm. But with exposure came retaliation. The very next day, the silver sedan that had haunted our street was gone, replaced instead by a black SUV parked brazenly across from the shelter's entrance. The message was clear. They no longer cared to hide. That night, when Aaliyah and I returned from a meeting with Sana, we found the door to the shelter cracked open. The lock twisted as though it had been ripped apart by unseen hands. Inside, chaos waited. The room had been overturned, papers scattered, drawers gutted, the laptop smashed into silence. My stomach dropped when I noticed the one drawer left open, the one where we had hidden the flash drive. Gone. Panic roared in my chest. The Alia's hand on my arm steadied me. They think this ends it, she murmured, her eyes burning with something fierce. They don't know we've scattered the truth like seeds. Still, the violation cut deep. It wasn't just evidence they had stolen, it was safety, sanctuary, the illusion of control. As we stood in the wreckage of what had once been a place of refuge, I realized this was no longer a story I was stumbling through. It was a war being written in real time, and I had become its unwilling narrator. For the first time, a thought I had fought to bury clawed its way to the surface. Maybe survival would demand not just exposing them, but becoming something far colder, harder, and more relentless than the woman I once was. The shelter's destruction marked a turning point I could never return from. With our safe haven violated, Alia and I vanished into the veins of the city, moving like hunted animals. We slept in borrowed rooms above bakeries, in basements that smelled of rust and damp stone, never lingering long enough to leave a trace. Yet with every shift, I felt myself hardening, my fear shaping into a blade instead of a cage. Sana, undeterred by the break-in, released another installment of her investigation, this time naming names. Politicians, businessmen, even a police commissioner, all tied to the chain of exploitation we had uncovered. The city erupted. Protests surged like tidal waves, women flooding the streets with placards and voices that refused to be drowned. But resistance came just as swiftly. At night, smoke rose from neighborhoods where agitators had been silenced, and bodies appeared in alleys as warnings written in flesh. In the chaos, Bilal vanished. His apartment was found empty, his phone abandoned on a table, screen cracked. Alia feared the worst, but I forced myself to believe he had gone underground, hiding as we had. Still, his disappearance gnawed at me like a wound that wouldn't close. Then, one night, as I scanned the news on a borrowed phone, a video surfaced. A hooded figure, bound to a chair, his voice barely audible, through swollen lips. Bilal. The captors didn't show their faces, but their message was clear. We have him. Return what you stole, or watch him disappear, forever. My hands trembled so violently the phone nearly slipped from my grip. The screen went black, but the threat lingered, searing itself into me. They weren't just trying to silence us anymore. They were turning the war personal, dragging every fragile thread of loyalty and love into their furnace. And I knew, with an icy certainty, that the next move had to be mine, or we'd lose more than just evidence. We'd lose everyone who had dared to stand beside me. I am Sheer, 29 years old, and tonight I write this not as the frightened bride who once stood abandoned in a wedding dress, clutching a file labeled, "This is your husband," but as a woman forged in the fire of betrayal, corruption, and blood. When Bilal's broken face flickered across that video, something inside me snapped, not in despair, but in resolve. I realized their greatest weapon had always been fear. The fear of silence, the fear of erasure, the fear that no one would listen. So I chose to turn their weapon against them. Together with Alia and Sana, we unleashed every last shred of evidence, no longer in fragments but in full, pouring it into the veins of the internet where it could never be destroyed. Names, dates, accounts, photographs, the empire of shadows was dragged screaming into the light. The storm it ignited was unlike anything I had imagined. Cities shook with outrage, governments wavered, and those who thought themselves untouchable suddenly found their faces plastered on banners demanding justice. I knew there would be a cost. They would hunt me. They would brand me a liar, a traitor, a ghost. But I no longer feared being erased, because my story was already out there, etched into thousands of screens, whispered in millions of voices. If they took my life, they would never take my truth. I began this journey as a woman forced into silence, into a marriage built on secrets, abandoned to a destiny not my own. I ended as something else entirely. A survivor who became a weapon, a victim who became a witness, a shadow who became the fire. And if my voice reaches you now, remember this. Stories like mine do not end when the page closes. They live in you, in your choices, in your courage to resist silence. So if you've listened this far, do not look away. Do not let them win. Share my journey, carry it forward, and keep the fire alive. Like, subscribe, and join me, because this war is only just beginning.